Hello and welcome to week 4 here in Sociology, where we're going to be taking on chapters 7 and 8. Very interesting topics to be looking at considering what's going on these days. So let's take a look at the course book. And here we are in Deviance, Crime, and Social Control. And we'll see a little bit. I got a movie for you to look at perspectives on deviance. And what we're going to be learning about in this particular chapter is identifying social control mechanisms that exist within your own personal social groups. We'll talk about what that is. Discuss the effectiveness of social movements like we're seeing today, such as the social movement for BLM. And discuss others' response to deviant behavior. So we'll be getting into some of that. Those are kind of what aligns with the assessments that we have going. The first thing to talk about, of course, is deviance. And when we think about the word deviant, we think in highly negative ways. That if we look at someone and say they're a deviant, then we would think certainly acting in ways outside of the social norms. However, that doesn't necessarily mean bad. Elite athletes are deviants. These golfers and these tennis players and football players and stuff, they're aliens or something. They're just not the same as everybody else. That's what makes them elite. And in technically speaking, they're very far deviant from the norm. So I want us to remove the pejorative sense of what deviant means and really look at this as something that deviates from the center. Many of you probably have aspects of yourself that you consider deviant. You're very proud of them. You dress in a certain way, or you think about things in a certain way, or you like certain kinds of activities, and that makes you different than the people around you. So that deviance is not necessarily a bad thing. Now that deviance, however, is socially defined. So it kind of depends who you're with, which group you're in. So there's probably behaviors you have that are perfectly normal when you're around your friends, but perfectly deviant when you're around your grandparents or something like that. So we see that where behavior lies on the deviant scale, the continuum, really depends on who you're with. And that's why it's a very important topic in sociology, where we talk about defining what is normal is a culture that is represented in each one of the groups, and they don't necessarily all have to be the same, even if we live in the same larger American culture, which does have norms and values and whatnot. We have a criminal justice system that talks about the big no's and what's going to happen if you do that. But within the United States, within whatever country you live in, there are social groups that have their own cultures and their own set of norms. So, excuse me, that's kind of what we're looking at when we look at the term deviance. Deviance can be positive, looking at that. And then we're introduced to the notion of social control. And this is probably one of my favorite topics in sociology for sure, that every group, every society has a system, and the general term is called social control. And what it is a built-in system that monitors the behavior of its members and takes action when they start acting outside the expectations of that group. Now, on the big scale of society, we have the criminal justice system. We have a code of laws that outline what is okay and what is not okay for certain people, in certain roles, certain situations. We have a court system that determines, well, did you really mean to do it? Or was it an accident? Or were there circumstances that we need to take into consideration before we punish you for what you did? And then there's the correction system, which can incarcerate you, fine you, take things away, those kinds of things as a repercussions or consequence for acting outside the behavior, all with the goal of don't do that again, bringing you back in to the fold. Stop acting outside the norm, pull yourself back in. Now, as I say that, you're probably thinking, well, there's all kinds, who's making these laws, and what if I don't agree with those laws? And we're seeing a lot of that happen right now, civil disobedience, and we're saying, well, that might be the law, but I don't agree with it. And therein lies the concept of social control as part of, and this is a large issue, the social contract. The social contract is we're in a society and we agree to be part of that society on the unwritten agreement. Maybe we didn't sign, I'll modify that in just a second. Maybe we didn't sign a paper saying, yes, I'm going to agree with all these laws, but we get the benefits of being part of a country or a society or a group or whatever, and that group has a certain say in what we do. So on a large scale, we are talking to the people that are in my immediate audience. We're Americans, and we live in the state of Maine, and therefore we are subject to the laws that have been passed by our representatives that we sent by voting to, like it or not. They set the law, and we are obligated to follow it. And that is part of the social contract. Now, I say we never signed the line, but in fact, if you've registered to vote, you have actually, that kind of technical term, and I've seen this interpreted in different ways, you're actually signing over your constitutional rights for self-governance to a representative who will act on your behalf in the process of creating laws, both the laws and the ways of reinforcing them or enforcing them. So there is a little bit of a signing when you become registered to vote, and by registering to vote, you have a say as to who's going to represent you. So getting away from all the yuckiness of politics, it really is a mechanism where I could say, I'm too busy to kind of like worry about all the things that are going on, about the environment, about taxes, about, that detail stuff. I'd really like to send a smart person down to Augusta, or I want to send smart people down to Washington, and I want them to do this for me and, govern the country. And so we do that. We sign up, we register to vote, and every once in a while we get the opportunity to pick who we want. Don't always get who we want, but that's our system. That's how we have representative government. And so that's at the big scale. In a small scale, just look at your family. There are social control mechanisms in your family, particularly when you were young. Your parents were basically the Senate and House of Representatives. They were, almost gods. They dictated what was going to happen, what wasn't going to happen, depending on the degree to which they were authoritative in their parenting. So when you did something out of line, they may or may not have had a planned response for that. They might have created one on the spot. They might have put you on a behavior plan. Either way, they gave you repercussions for your behavior. So let's just be light about this. You put your elbows on the table during lunch, or during dinner, and your parents, no elbows on the table. That's a norm. It's an expectation of our society. Well, don't do it. And most of the time, most of you probably said, oh, I forgot and stuff like that. Imagine for a moment if you just went, what are you going to do about it, Pa? Imagine. And to challenge that, and what you then encounter is the social control mechanism of that small group. They don't call the police because the nation is not in charge of whether you put elbows on the table. However, in your family, there may be consequences that you may be sent to your room. You may get a swat on the butt. You might, whatever it is that you grew up with, those were the consequences of your behavior. And so in every single group that you belong to, there are social control mechanisms. There are expectations for your behavior as part of the group of Soc 101 in my class. Those are outlined in the student handbook. They're outlined in my syllabus. The expectations are there. The consequences including grades, high grades, medium grades, low grades, failing the class, passing the class, graduating, getting kicked out of school. All of those are the laid out consequences of social control that are saying, toe the line, do all your work, do all the discussions, do your best work, and you will be rewarded. That's the way that group works. Your friends, Just think about your core group of close friends. They also have norms and expectations. And if I had the opportunity, I'd kind of canvass you and say, give me some examples of some things that you're expected to do as friends. You're supposed to share things when things are going on. You're supposed to support one another. You're supposed to spend time with one another and prioritize that. And so imagine that you're going through a very, very difficult time. Having a really rough time with your spouse or with your partner or at work or whatever, and you have a very, very best friend. And the rule in that friendship is that you share information with each other. What would happen if you didn't tell them? What if they found out and they found out you were having this really big trouble with your husband or wife, and they're like, you never told me about that? It'd be almost like a violation of the friendship. It almost to the core of like the existence of the friendship. I mean, a friendship based on the mutual interaction of sharing trouble and sharing good times and stuff, because we're there to support each other, and you chose not to do that. We might even question whether we're friends. That's how important that is. So the consequence of doing that would be this questioning of the friendship. Maybe you've been in a situation like that. Person that you thought was your best friend wasn't telling you what was going on in their life, and you felt a little bad about that. So that's part of that social control mechanism that exists at all levels of society. So here we are, keep on going. We look at the next part in the course book here. I'm looking at the course book as I go through, is civil disobedience. And here we see what's going on in our world right now. Now, we're going to be pragmatic and say that the BLM movement is a combination of different movements. There's a legitimate gripe that people of color have about how they've been treated in America. We can dicker about the statistics or whatever and all those things, but certainly the experience of being black in America is very different than being white. The experience of being women or experience of being gay is very different than the experience of other people. And in a society that claims for equality and equity, they're not very happy about that. Now, people challenge the social norms, sometimes by demonstrating. And sometimes a small group of those individuals go too far and they break the law in their demonstrations, in their vigor, or maybe they have just wrong motives. Maybe some people are latching onto this for their own personal gain. When everybody's going crazy about this thing, they take the opportunity to get a new TV or something like that. And that's all mixed in there, and it really discolors what is going on when we think about civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is the same thing as revolt. Depending on what side you're on is whether we consider it good or not. The civil disobedience that gave the birth of the United States, that we call the Revolution, involved a lot of things that were against the law at the time. Destroying of property, refusing to pay taxes, all of that stuff. But it was on our side, kind of thing. So let's make sure that we keep that lens correct, that we may not understand where people are coming from when they're destroying things and when they're breaking the law, trying to express a valid grievance. Now, I'm not into people, for whatever reason, breaking the law. We have ways in which people can express civil disobedience without destroying other people or hurting other people and stuff like that. And hopefully that will rise to the top in this movement. But civil disobedience is when groups of people decide they're not going to follow the rules anymore. They're going to do what they want to do because they feel the rules are wrong. They are challenging the social contract. They want to see change, and they're going to force change. And, the thing about American society is when we look at the athletes that kneel, or we look at BLM, or we look at gay pride, and we look at any one of these things, these kinds of really, let's call them deviance from the norms kind of thing, is really a lot about what our country is about. America was built on people that we're not doing well in other places, and certainly without getting into the concept of the invasion of North America, there were people here already, and looking just at that, but looking at the people that now occupy the United States. They're an onerous bunch. We like to take charge of our lives. We like to say, I'm not going to do that. And we engage in those kinds of things. Sometimes it gets out of control and we need to reel that in. And I'm not making light of that. I mean, that's very, very, very important. And for some people, they think that kind of extreme, let's tear something down, might be the thing that wakes people up, makes the powers that be finally take notice of what they've been experiencing all this time. So I ask you to kind of like set back from these things and take a look at them and consider the situations that people are in that have led large groups of people to do this. And it's kind of a big part of what America is about. We do demonstrations. We have done that since the beginning, and so those demonstrations have really shaped a lot of what our culture is today. So we get to the end of the chapter, and we're looking at the assessments for this chapter itself. So in the first discussion, I'm having you actually do an experiment, engage in a little bit of deviance. And I'll give you an example just so you understand what I'm talking about. I'm asking you to be deviant about something and go out and do it in public. Might be difficult these days, we'll see. Might be something at home, whatever. But in the past, I've had a student, there's a couple students that went to McDonald's all dressed up. They ordered a meal, brought all their silverware, brought glassware, put everything and made the table and just enjoyed their like a formal meal at McDonald's. And so of course they got a lot of attention. People were laughing, commenting on, asking them what they're doing. And what I'm asking you to do is to come up with something like that. Do a activity that's a little off the center, and then ask the people around them, how did they feel about that? I mean, this takes a lot of courage. I expect you would not do this alone. You would just go do it. You could also do it at home. Let's say this is really, really, it's a little risky, and please don't get into any big arguments about this. But let's say you have a routine with your partner that you tell each other about your day and stuff like that. Try skipping it one time, or try just like being consumed by your phone while they're trying to talk to you, and kind of see what happens when it is almost instantaneous. And it's almost instantaneous when people are violating what we expect from them, that we get angry. Now, don't start it if you have a volatile relationship. Please don't do this. If you have a relationship that shouldn't be added to like this, don't do it. Find another way. But be creative about what you can come up with, in terms of your family, or going out in public and doing something. Don't do anything illegal. I've had two students that almost got arrested for driving through the same McDonald's, drove through the drive-through backwards, explaining that the driver didn't want anything, the passenger wanted something, and they called the cops on them. Don't do stuff like that. Not a good idea. Okay, so the second discussion is to kind of get into this idea of civil disobedience and movements of yesteryear and today. We think about all the movements that have happened around the world. You can look those up. Look up social movements, and there's hundreds that have occurred all over the world. And then consider that also in light of the current social movements that are going on right now, with particularly with BLM and police brutality and those kinds of things. And finally, in the quiz, I'm going to have you, kind of like I talked at the beginning, you think about your own social groups and the social control mechanisms that are there for them. And what would happen, describe that norm, and then what would happen if you violated it? Would you get kicked out of the group? Would there be a process that, like, hey, we need to have a talking to? Might be formal. Maybe you belong to a snowmobile club, and if you decided that you were going to go wreck some of the trails, that might get you kicked out, or you're not going to pay your dues anymore. That gets you kicked out. Start swearing or something, because there's a no swear rule during the meetings. There was even this. There was one semester. There was a. It just so happens that I gave someone this assignment, and they described their their involvement in UBM, United Bikers of Maine. And the United Bikers of Maine had just passed a rule that people could not diss each other simply because they didn't own a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. You know, there's a hierarchy. You know, Harley-Davidson considered the preeminent motorcycle for motorcycle enthusiasts, and they said that UBM exists for all motorsports, for all motorcycle sports, and therefore there should be no condemning of people simply because they choose to ride a different machine. And he talked about the struggle with change, that just become the norm to diss somebody, you just got a little Honda or something like that, and I got a Harley. And, that kind of back and forth, it was a social change happened. And my understanding right now, it's probably all gone now. There's probably still people that feel that way, but in terms of United Bikers of Maine, much greater diversity of people enjoying that organization now. So there's our chapter 7. Let's take a look at chapter 8. Here we're going to be talking, our favorite, right? Media and technology. In this day, I cannot imagine a more influential aspect of our society right now. Influential, at least in terms of people's emotions. The actual influence on voting and whatnot is kind of questionable. As much as we like to think that social media is sort of like the platform where these decisions are made, there's not a whole lot of evidence about that. But there is a lot of evidence of people getting very worked up based on what they see. Lots of manipulation of social media to get people thinking or reacting in certain ways. And I want to give you some permission. If you find yourself overwhelmed by social media, you are free to turn it off. You are free to not participate in Facebook or any one of the other, that's about the only one I know, Instagram, Twitter, those. It's okay not to go there. It's okay. I have got caught up in some discussions that led to some really kind of difficult conversations with people that I considered friends. And so I'm not quite sure if it's worth it. So nonetheless, here we are talking about media and technology, and we see that the first thing I bring up in the course book is one of the basic issues that comes up in sociology, and that is inequality. The fact is, the majority of the world still does not have internet access, that does not have devices, does not have iPhones, does not, all that stuff. So the idea that this is a global movement and it's becoming more and more and more accessible, certainly just even within my own lifetime, it's tripled the number of, the percentage of population that has access to these devices, but it's not a definitive everybody kind of thing. Maybe everybody in your circle has these things. Maybe America, but it's certainly there's some inequality. We have seen this manifest itself with COVID-19 when people have been sent home, and when we realized that schools realized some people don't have computers at home, or some people don't have internet access at home, and it almost seems arrogant. It almost seems, when I was first in college, I went to a school in Long Island, and it was a very, very ritzy college with very wealthy people there, and I made friends there, and I didn't come from money, but it was things like we'd be having conversations, and they'd be talking about that they summered in southern France that year, and I'm like, wow, that'd be really cool. I've never been to France. And they'd look at me like I had 3 heads. What do you mean never been to France? And in a way, it felt arrogant, but the fact is, they've never met anyone who's ever not been to France. Within their social world, it's not arrogance, it's experience. They just really had never met anyone who didn't have those kinds of things for them. The same way that education, even though maybe in the back of the head we knew, not everybody has this, but then, wow, there was a lot of people that didn't have this. So even at KVCC, we have ended up helping some people get internet access, provide them with computers, get certain student loans for that. The bookstore now carries computers to try and make up for that gap. When school then changed, pivoted, we moved the cheese, as they say, and you had to start taking classes all online. Boom, we got reminded of the gap of technology, of the haves and the have-nots right here in our own community. So it was a very, very powerful experience for a lot of people at KV. Okay, so I have in the book some perspectives on the media. What do we take from the media? What's the purpose of the media, which is to sell things? And, where do we get our facts? How do we fact check? All of these things that really kind of put on you the responsibility of consuming media well. And essentially the advice being, if it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't. If it sounds outrageous, it probably isn't true. There's outrageous stuff, but I've been around long enough to know that most of the stuff is really not that. Doesn't really hold a lot. I want to get into a couple concepts related to how we consume media and naturally occurring psychological processes that were central in the book that I'm recommending that you get by Steven Pinker. And the name of that book is Enlightenment Now. And just get it. Save up the money. It's pretty cheap, actually. It's in paperback and all that, so you can get it. Just get the book. It's just really beyond the chapter, what it does. But it introduces you, he's a psychologist, and he introduces you to a couple things that happen when we consume media that explain kind of what we see in social media going on right now. One of them is a negativity bias. We all want good news, but we are glued to bad news. Well, just think about it. The Smiths got a brand new dog. And we're like, okay, cool. The neighbors, the Smiths get a brand new dog. We're like, awesome, they got a brand new dog. But if their house catches on fire, everybody's out there watching it. Nobody went out to celebrate the brand new dog, but we all went out to watch their house burn. And so we're glued. We have this bias toward where things go wrong. And part of the psychology of that is that if somebody else has it worse, then I feel better about me. It's a little weird, isn't it? This is a little bit of weird psychology in this kind of thing. And that's real. So we're like, so bad news. You look at the news channels themselves. Like them or not, they present a selection of the media. They selection of stuff. A lot of it is really bad news. Sometimes they even put a segment at the end for good news because they know that almost everything they've talked about up until that time was bad news. Create some kind of balance. There's a gazillion good things going on. Even the perspective of something like the BLM revolts that are going on. There are literally thousands of demonstrations going on right now, but the ones you see on television, the ones that we want to see because we have this negativity bias, are the ones that have violent acts. That ties into another psychological concept called availability heuristics. And what that is, heuristics is the way that we problem solve and come to conclusions. Availability means we use the things that are around us. Now just think for a moment. I want to formulate an opinion about BLM. So I look at the things that are available to me. I look at the media, I look at people's opinions, look at social media, look at the news and all that stuff. And really, what conclusion would I draw? Unless I do a deeper investigation requiring more effort, going into other different sources, I'm going to be stuck drawn to the conclusions that were presented to me, that were made available to me. Yet, those are subject to the editing of the news agencies who understand that you as a human being want to see bad stuff. So they're presenting it. The news gives us exactly what we want. And in the psychological level, we want the truth, we want that, but we kind of want it to be interesting. You know, a movie that just goes along and the relationship has no problems is not an entertaining movie. We need a good argument. We need, you know, the cheating spouse. We need, you know, that's drama. We want to see that. We look at the reality shows. If everybody what if all the Kardashians got along? They wouldn't have a television show. So it's all the craziness. It's all that stuff that we're drawn to. But when we simply use that, when we use our problem-solving ability and we just use what's available to us in the immediate surroundings, we will not have the full picture. So our responsibility as academics is to go further, to not accept that. That's a piece of the picture. Those are not real. I mean, it exists, but I'm not a really big fan of the term fake news as much as selective news. When you only look at a little narrow picture of something and you're not looking at the big thing, it makes that thing look very, very specific. And the intent is for that specific. And so we have to be much better consumers of the media in order to take into consideration both our negativity bias and our availability heuristics. And these two terms are explored in depth in Steven Pinker's book, which has actually become a required textbook in my psychology seminar for introducing students to the psychology program. It is that profound. So please, if you ever get a chance to get that book, it's really amazing. Okay, so on to the assignments for this particular chapter. We have a discussion and a quiz. The discussion has you talking about those two concepts, about availability heuristics and negativity bias. It's time to put your hand up and say, I got it. I've got it. You've got it. We've all got it. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about how that steered us wrong, how it's made us view certain people in a certain way, how it creates other kinds of bias, prejudice, discrimination, all of these things, because our natural tendency is toward that. In the quiz, I'm having you define in your own words technological inequality. And it would be really interesting to see you include some examples about what COVID has done to actually bring that to life, if there's any examples in your life, you know, people that you knew, or maybe even yourself having experienced some inequality there. And the second kind of going along with that is to step back and say, well, what are the negative and positives about that inequality? You could probably imagine, I'll give you a little hint here, but a positive, of course, you can engage in these discussions and have the technology. But the negative is you're not as distracted, you know, by technology, and you're glued to your phone all the time. So build on that. Build on that concept for that particular quiz. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this little lecture. I actually talked way more than I thought I was going to. So have a great week, and I'll see you in the discussion boards.